we are gathered to look at our material. We are still in the introduction. I need papers. Papers. Dave, you got your papers? Yeah, okay. All right. Okay, here you go.
Thank
You got yours, Gene?
No.
You do? Okay. There you go. You guys got yours?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Okay, and we were in the midst of discussing the various Jewish groups at the time of Jesus, the Pharisees and such. If you go back to page 3 real quick, just want to pick up on one note that we didn't talk about last time. Page 3. I know I got page 4 up here, but let's go back to page 3 real quick. And I want to look at the third paragraph from the bottom. And talk just a little bit about the apocalyptic writings. The word apocalypse means really something to be revealed, something hidden that needs to be revealed. And apocalyptic, because of the many references in the revelation of Jesus to John in the book of Revelation, many of those pictures are pictures of the end times. It is because of that the word apocalyptic has taken on different meaning. It doesn't just mean hidden anymore, or something that needs to be revealed. Or mysterious. It tends now to mean when people say something's apocalyptic, they mean utterly destructive, or destructive like in the Judgment Day kind of destruction. Okay, so a battle can be apocalyptic in the sense, not in the sense of predicting the future or being something that revealing anything, but apocalyptic in the sense of very, very destructive as if it were the last day. Same with hurricanes, tornadoes, and stuff like that. It can be apocalyptic. But apocalyptic literature did not start with John revelation from Jesus. There was apocalyptic literature long before. So in the years between the return from Babylon, the Jews, again, remember that Jerusalem was destroyed. The first temple was destroyed in 586 BC, 586 years before Jesus. And then 70 years later, the Jews returned under the edict of Cyrus the Mede, or the Medo-Persian. And then Darius. So that's, you add 70 years to that, so you're around the year 500, give or take. The final prophet Malachi, he is dated anywhere between 350 and 400. And then you have the intertestamental period of time where you've got the Greeks taking over Palestine, and then eventually the Romans. During this period of time, during this upheaval, and also during the time that God did not send any further prophets. Okay, no further prophets were sent by God that we know of. In other words, that was left records in the Bible. There were people who claimed to be prophets, but there was always problems with their prophecies and their writings. A guy like Tobit, for example, good fella, but not inspired. The Maccabees, good historians, but not inspired. Along with those books that the Roman Church has in their Bible, okay, became some other writings, especially from the Essenes and others, that were apocalyptic in nature. In other words, the point of the writings was to try to predict and describe the coming of the Messiah. And by this time, the Jews have got things kind of messed up, and they've got this problem where they don't see the many parts of the revelation of the Messiah. In other words, they don't see a difference between his first coming and his second coming. They get the first and second comings of the Messiah mixed up, and they conflate them into one appearance. So this is a real problem, of course. They didn't, since they see the glorious coming of the Messiah at the same time that they see the humble coming of the Messiah, that's going to be a problem, right? And so they have a real hard time with this. This is why, one of the reasons why they rejected the carpenter of Nazareth, Jesus Christ, as Messiah, because he didn't fit the whole thing. Well, of course he didn't. He didn't fit the glorious thing, because there you've got the white horse, a guy on the white horse and a sword, and you've got destruction of the enemy armies, and you've got all kinds of thrones, and all kinds of great stuff. And so since Jesus didn't do any of that, because it was his first coming, not his second coming, the Jews got all confused. But this is one of the reasons, is because all of their writing during this period of time is apocalyptic writing. They're not thinking about an intermediate coming of the Messiah. That is, the Messiah comes and actually accomplishes the growth of the kingdom of God over thousands of years before the last day. They see the Messiah coming, and it's the last day. Boom, that's it. And so they're all mixed up. So this idea of apocalyptic writing, look at that paragraph. It must be noted that the apocalyptic writings of Judaism were not divulged to the masses. These were things that were studied in the rabbi schools. These are things that were studied among the Sadducees and Pharisees and scribes. These were things that were studied by scholars, and sometimes by people who are into things like astrology and whatever. The average Jew, the average run-of-the-mill guy, a guy like Mary and Joseph, people like Mary and Joseph, or even priests like John's father, Zacharias, guys like the Pharisee, what's his name? Nicodemus, okay? Guys like that, a lot of them wouldn't be into this stuff, these apocalyptic writings. You kind of, in other words, this was nerd territory, what we would call today nerd territory. If you're a real nerd, this was something you would study, okay? The halakha, the secrets of God, was given from teacher to pupil. To compete with the New Testament, it was finally written down during the first century and so lost its secrecy. The Old Testament was maintained in sacred Hebrew, and there was opposition to writing it in the commonplace Aramaic. This is why you find both the Old and the New Testament in Greek, but you don't find the Old Testament very much in Aramaic. You have some in Aramaic, very little portions of Daniel in Aramaic. But that's it. They didn't do a whole translation of the Old Testament from Hebrew into Aramaic. And you might wonder why. Well, because they thought that it would lose something in translation. It didn't have to if they were good enough. But the Greek translation of the Old Testament is mistaken in numerous places. It's not really a very good translation, frankly. It gets a lot of things right, most things right, but it gets a lot of things wrong too. So I think this was that they were concerned about, and so you're not going to find a lot of manuscripts around of Hebrew, the Old Testament in Aramaic. You are going to find, interestingly enough, you're going to find it in Syriac. You are going to find it in Peshitta, which is the writings of Persia, now Iran, and things like that. But you're not going to find it in Aramaic, strangely enough. The Greek version, called the Septuagint, was used by some of the common people and those in the diaspora. In other words, those people living out in the Greek and Roman world, they used the Greek version. So the Septuagint became very popular and very commonplace. I would say the Septuagint held the same place for the apostles as King James does for us. In other words, if you ask the apostles about a story in the Old Testament, they're not going to quote you back in Hebrew. They're going to quote you in Greek. And sometimes worse, they themselves are going to translate the Greek from Greek into Aramaic. So then you've got from Hebrew to Greek to Aramaic. And so when the apostles are writing the Gospels, and when Paul is writing his epistles, and he quotes the Old Testament, quotes Psalms or something, or Genesis or whatever, a lot of times you'll find it different than the verses in the same Bible you're reading out. You're reading in here in the NASB in Romans or something, and then he quotes something in the Old Testament, and you look back and you compare what he has, what they have translated here in the New Testament in Romans back with something in Genesis, and you'll see it's not the same. And you wonder, how can that be? It's the same translation. Well, no, it's not, in a way, because what's happened is that the Old Testament is now, that's from the direct Hebrew that we have, but what Paul was quoting from was from the Septuagint. And sometimes Peter and James will quote from Aramaic version of the New Testament. Okay, so that's why sometimes you wonder why the quotes from the Old Testament that are in the New Testament don't match. They don't match. And I always thought it would be better, rather than going ahead and translating in the New Testament, just go back and grab that verse and just put that verse right there. That's what the apostles intended. That's what they intended you to do. They intended you to look that up and have it there. The scribes, let's skip the scribes here. A lot of myth there. And then the expression, just a real quick, the expression the scribes and Pharisees it seems to always occur together in the New Testament. The Pharisees were separated ones. They were held in high esteem, the upper class, even though they had no formal education. Now, I say formal, that doesn't mean they weren't smart. They were very smart. Most of them were highly educated. There were people like Paul, but they didn't have formal education. Of course, they didn't have colleges in those days. First college was the University of Paris. The University of Paris was established, anybody know? What century? 14th century, 1300s. I can't remember the exact year, but the University of Paris is really recognized as the first true university. So they didn't have universities for 1,300 years after Christ. So where did you get your formal education? Well, your formal education you would get mostly at convents and monasteries, or in the case of the days of Jesus, you would have rabbi schools. And there were a couple of famous rabbi schools. And that's where people got their education. But most Pharisees didn't go to rabbi schools. A lot of them did, but not most of them. Most of them were self-educated. But they were always connected closely to the scribes. There were about 6,000 Pharisees at the time of Herod the Great, and many more scribes, probably twice as many maybe. Pharisees were attacked by Jesus for their hypocrisy, not their theological education. The reason Jesus didn't like the Pharisees was not because they were wealthy, which a lot of them were, not all of them, but a lot of them, or because they wore fancy clothes, or because they were very smart. He was opposed to them because they were legalists, and worse than that, they were legalistic hypocrites. Nothing worse than a legalist except a hypocrite legalist. That's worse than a regular legalist. The leaders had influential members of Pharisees in their small communities were the scribes. Almost all the Pharisees were scribes, but not all scribes were Pharisees. So most of the Pharisees could be scribes and function very often as scribes. Because if you're going to educate yourself, one of the first things you're going to do is teach yourself to read and write something besides the Old Testament in Hebrew. Because all the men had to do that for your bar mitzvah. For your bar mitzvah, you have to write a section of the Old Testament, and then memorize it and speak it, read it, speak it out in the ceremony in the synagogue. You don't have to do that today, but you used to have to do that. So that's why all scribes are Pharisees, but not all Pharisees are scribes. Or no, the other way around. All Pharisees are scribes, but not all scribes are Pharisees. Okay. All right, let's move on to page 4 then. So, let's continue talking a little bit about the Pharisees. They're a fascinating group, And the reason also why I like to talk about the Pharisees is because they're still around today. Most of the Jewish groups that were around in Jesus' day, like the Essenes, for example, they're not around. They're extinct. Sadducees are extinct. You can't find them anywhere. But the Pharisees are alive and well in Judaism. Pharisees were influential and powerful and had the people's support. You would think the people wouldn't like them. And it wasn't a matter of like. It was a matter of the people were kind of dependent upon them. Remember, the Pharisees were kind of the people who were the ones you would go to figure out what the Bible meant, or to figure out how you lived. You know, if there was a question, a moral question, ethical question in your life, with your family or something, you would go to a Pharisee and ask him, and he would tell you this is how you handle that. Sadducees were actually quite weak in power and authority by comparison. Now, they ruled the temple. They ruled the temple. They ruled over the sacrifices. They ruled over the Temple Mount, the whole area around the temple. They were very, very, very powerful in that area and with religion. But outside of the temple, they didn't really hold much power. The Pharisees had grown up in opposition to the Sadducees. Sadducees arose first. When the people returned from Babylon, well, I shouldn't really say that. The Pharisees, or people like the Pharisees, had already started to bubble up in Babylon. Now, when the Jews returned from Babylon to Jerusalem, the Sadducees kind of set themselves up right away, because they said, well, we need to regulate the temple worship. We need to do that. We need to make sure everything's done right. And but they weren't real keen on keeping separate between them and the pagans. You know, a lot of pagans had moved into Judea and Jerusalem during their absence, especially Greeks, Romans, Egyptians, Syrians, Phoenicians, Philistines, all kinds of people, Hittites. A lot of them moved into that area when the Jews were taken off to Babylon. And so when the Jews came back, a lot of people were living there. And the people who ruled the temple said, we're not concerned about separating from them. We're only concerned about how the worship should be conducted. That's it. That's what we're concerned about. We don't care about anything else. The Pharisees said, no, we can't be mixing up with these people. And so that right away, they started to separate. The Pharisees still exist today, not as an organized body. I mean, you're not going to, look in the internet and find, the International Association of Pharisees. No. But in reality, almost all Jewish rabbis and their leaders are Pharisees in teaching and practice. I would say all of your Orthodox rabbis, all of your conservative rabbis, all of your Hasidim rabbis, the extreme Orthodox, are all Pharisees. Reformed, I don't know. Reformed are not quite, wouldn't maybe fit in that category. Actually, even though I say here the Sadducees died out, that which is true, if anybody is any close to Sadducees, it would be the Reformed rabbis and the Reformed leaders of Reformed Judaism, because they're very liberal. And the Sadducees, for all of their conservatism for the forms and the worship of the temple, they were very liturgical, they were very insistent upon things being done just right and all this kind of stuff in the temple. But as far as the real religion, as far as acting the religion, as far as accepting the whole Old Testament, no, they didn't do that. So they were kind of immoral in that sense. In many ways, we move on, the most important people in Jerusalem and Israel were, of course, the Romans. They really, talk about influence. These are the people that influenced what was going on in Judea and in Jerusalem, and really throughout the world, frankly, especially at the time of Jesus. The way God planned it, the way God had it set up and act out, was that the Roman Empire grew in power and extent until about the time of Jesus. And about that time of Jesus is when the Roman Empire reached its pinnacle. It really did. During those early years of the first century, that's when the Roman Empire was at its height. You could say maybe from from the time of Christ, so from zero, there's no 0 year, but from year 1, or maybe even go back further, maybe 10, 12, some back in there, all the way to maybe 150, time of Marcus Aurelius. This was really the high spot. Sometimes people talk about the Pax Romana. There was about 200 years where there was not a large-scale war. There were wars, there were little wars, there were little guerrilla wars, there were even little civil wars. But they were relatively minor, the battles were relatively small, the conflict was relatively short-lived. So that's why they call it the Peace of Rome. That's 200 years. A few years before Christ to almost 200 years after Christ. That's called the Pax Romana, the Peace of Rome. And it was very good that God did it that way, because as the Romans are building up their power and everything, of course they're subduing a lot of enemies, they're subduing a lot of people, and they're keeping peace, okay? And so then that peace lasts for about 200 years, and then this Roman Empire starts to unravel. And it takes them about 200 years, 150 to 200 years to completely collapse. From the time that you start seeing cracks and you start seeing problems to the end, which is 476 years after Christ. That's when the Western Roman Empire ceases to exist. The Eastern Roman Empire, now that goes on till 1053. So it goes on another 500 years. But anyway, the Western Empire starts to crack about 200, 225, and by 475, 476, it's kaplooey. Any case, so you have that 200 years. So you've got these great roads. You've got everybody speaking the same language. They're all speaking Greek and Roman, Greek and Latin. You've got everybody kind of on the same page as far as legal things are concerned. The laws of Rome rule most of the world. You've got Roman armies keeping everybody at peace. You've got you call it the constabulary, okay, not police officers as we know them, but you've got people that are keeping the peace in the villages and towns and stuff like that. You can't swing a dead cat without hitting a Roman. They're everywhere, and they're watching everything, and they're keeping everything under control. And they're keeping the roads maintained, and they're keeping the aqueducts flowing with water, and they're keeping trade going. And so perfect time for Christianity to spread throughout the known world. It's great planning. When you look back on it, you can see why God did what he did. It makes perfect sense looking back. Now, I'm sure at the time people didn't understand it, but looking back on it, it makes perfect sense. Once that was accomplished and Christianity was established, God didn't need the Roman Empire anymore, and so it died. Simple as that. You see this very common. I see it, of course, as a historian, I see it very commonly throughout history. You see it with the British Empire, you see it with the French Empire, you see it with various other European groups, you see it with the Russians, you see it with the Poles, the Italians, the Spanish. Spanish are another good example. The height of Spanish power, Christopher Columbus and all that kind of stuff. The Christianity spreading so that from the Rio Grande down to Antarctica, everybody's speaking Spanish. Now, granted, it's not exactly the same Spanish everywhere. And of course, Brazil speaks Portuguese, but that's close. I mean, they can kind of get along. And not only that, but Catholicism, for all its faults, is still Christian for the most part. And so, think about that. Think about that Spain just had that very little window of empire, where it was empire for only a couple hundred years, if that, really. And during that time, was able to colonize. And so you go to the Philippines, you find Roman Christians. You go to Guam, you find Roman Christians. Go to Tahiti, you find Roman Christians. Roman Christians all over the place. And the Spanish and the Spanish and the Portuguese also did mission work in Japan and China and Indonesia and Indochina and Vietnam area. So you find this Christianity was expanded all over the world through these various empires. Okay? First the Spanish Empire and the Portuguese, and then the French, and then the English finally, or the Dutch too for that matter, and then the English. And then finally, of course, during the time of Victoria, of course, you had that great mission explosion where those English missionaries are going down into Africa and all into Asia and everywhere, and India, and converting millions and millions and millions of people to Christianity. So you can see, as you look back in history, you can see how God is using nations and countries and people, generals and presidents and prime ministers and kings and queens and all kinds of things in order to accomplish his purpose. If you're at the time, you don't see the hand of God, or if you're within a few years, one way or another, you kind of don't see it. But if you look back over 100 years, 200 years, 300, 400 years, 500 years, 1,000 years, you say, "Ooh, okay, I can see that. All right, way to go, God. Okay, working out good." And so that's why empires rise and fall. That's why nations rise and fall. When God is done with one, he's done with it. He's done with it. It passes away. Goes away, and another one takes its place. That's the way it works. So Rome, very important. There was a good number of Roman citizens who made their living off the Jews. The majority of Romans in Israel, however, were those connected with the military and government. There were many army garrisons established throughout Palestine, and the occupation was keenly felt by the Jewish population. You couldn't go anywhere in Palestine without running into Romans. And I mean uniform Roman, I mean military. They guarded the roads, and there were outposts here and there all over the place. And there were garrisons, you would call them forts maybe, here and there all over the place. And that was true throughout the empire. So, and the Jews just kind of didn't like it. They just kind of rankled. It kind of, it kind of got behind their neck. They didn't like it. They didn't like walking around in Palestine and seeing these Romans everywhere, get out of our country, kind of deal. In most of the territories or nations Rome conquered, they exhibited a somewhat hands-off approach to ruling. So the Romans were very smart in that regard. Many empires you study down through history have not been that bright. A lot of empires come into an area, they take over the area, they win the war, whatever, conquer the area, and then they try to impose their governing system on the inhabitants. And it very, very seldom, almost hardly never works. It just never works. Once in a long while, rare case once in a while, but most of the time it just does not work. The Romans weren't that way. The Romans said, look, if you have a king, keep a king. You have a prime minister or whatever, keep him. You have a chief of a tribe, keep him. We don't care. We don't care. You have this religion, that religion, we don't care. Okay? As long as you pay your taxes on time to Rome, and as long as you burn incense to the emperor as God. Okay? Whatever else you do, don't bet, no skin off our nose. You want to have a parliament? Fine. Well, they didn't have such things, but anyway, if you wanted to have a parliament, have a parliament. If you want to have a dictatorship, have a dictatorship. If you want to have a tyranny, have a tyranny. If you want to have, whatever else kind of government you want, fine. You have any government you want, we don't care. And you have any religion, we don't care. As long as you behave yourself. Don't cause any trouble. You cause trouble, then we'll come and we'll smack you on the nose with newspaper. But otherwise, they don't care. And see, that's why I think the Roman Empire lasted. Aside from God's own allowance, I think that's why the Roman Empire lasted 1,000 years. 1,000 years, imagine that, 1,000 years. From the founding of Rome till it was overrun by the Gauls and the Visigoths and stuff. 1,000 years, 1,000 years. Because they were very wise. They knew better than to impose their ways of life on the people that they conquered or that they had to deal with. The British too, and the French. Not so much the French. The British were pretty good about that, actually. They really were. They didn't actually take over a lot of governments. They would allow those governments to work. Again, as long as they behaved themselves, as long as they paid their dues, as long as they, didn't persecute Christians, whatever. The British didn't go in and slaughter all the Hindus and Muslims in India. They couldn't. Too many of them, first of all. But even if they did, even if they wanted to, they didn't want to. That's the point. They didn't want to. And yeah, there were missionaries in there, yeah, but they didn't, no forced conversions, unlike the Spanish. A lot of forced conversions there and left a bad taste in the natives' mouth. French too, a lot of forced conversions. Not a good idea. Not a good idea. British were smart. British were smart. That's why their empire lasted a couple hundred years at least. Okay, Americans, I don't know. Americans not too bright. Okay, we try to come in and make democracy in Afghanistan. Oh yeah, right. That's going to work. Sure. The only thing democratic about Afghanistan is the bullets make the same holes. That's very democratic. It doesn't matter whose bullets they are, they all make the same kind of holes. That's it. That's all they know about democracy. And all they care to know about democracy. You know, they like tribal government. Tribal government fits them very nicely. You know. So it's always a mistake for a nation to go into another nation and try to impose their values and impose their way of life, impose their government, or even their religion on them. Okay, missionaries, fine, yeah, fine. You convert people, they're converted in their heart. Of course, that's great. God will lead them from there. Such would never be the case in Palestine due to the many insurrections and rebellions of the Jews. So even though the Jews had their kings and stuff, the real rulers were the Roman governors and the Roman prefects. That was not true throughout most of the Roman government. Think about that. If you're a world-traveling Jew, if you're a merchant, for example, from Jerusalem, and you go traveling the world, you notice that. When you come back home, you can tell people, you'll tell people, you know what? Those Gauls, there's not Roman in every corner. There's not forts all over the place. There's a few, but there's not tons of them. And their Roman prefects aren't ruling over the people in an extreme way. Why is this happening here? Because Judea was the worst Roman province in all of Roman history. Nobody was worse. They rebelled over and over and over and over and over again. They were always a thorn in the eye of the Romans. Always. Being assigned to Palestine was considered by both military men and government officials as being the most difficult, dangerous, unpleasant assignment one could be given. Do you remember that scene in Ben-Hur? Mm-hmm. When Charlton Heston meets Peter Ustinov, and I think it's Peter Ustinov, isn't it? I think. Anyway, he's just been named. He's a Herod. He's just been told to go back and rule over there. And he also sits in dinner with Pontius Pilate. He says, "Oh, you're going to Palestine?" Yeah. And they make comments. There's a Messiah under every rock, and there were. You read history. Josephus talks about half a dozen guys who were all named Jesus, by the way. Yeah, they were all named Jesus, and they're all running around saying, "I'm the Messiah." At the same time, Jesus Christ of Nazareth was doing that. People don't know that. Most people don't have no clue. They don't know how hard it was. You know, there's John the Baptist down at the river, he's doing it, and there's this 5 other Jesuses around who are baptizing people and you know, saying they're Son of God and all this other kind of stuff. It was hard, folks. You couldn't just you know, hey, would Jesus please raise your hand? You know, 6 hands go up. Whoa! Okay? So this was tough. This was very, very, very difficult for the Jews of Jesus' day. Not easy like we think. We think, you know, there's one guy around telling everybody he's Son of God. Wasn't that way. Wasn't that way at all. And this is why the Jews were so skeptical, the leaders, the Pharisees and everything. You know, this is why later on, read in the book of Acts when they talk about this. They talk about Jesus this and Jesus that, and they started this rebellion and that rebellion. What happened to them? They all got murdered and dead. So, you know, and Caiaphas, the high priest, he says, just let it alone. If it's of God, you're not going to be able to stop it. If it's not of God, which none of these are so far, it'll peter out on its own. Again, very wise advice. Very wise advice. But this is why, if you wonder, another reason why the Jewish leaders had a real hard time accepting Jesus of Nazareth as the Messiah. Because there were a lot of other competitors for that job. Next paragraph. During the last decades of the first century before Christ and the first decades of the first century of Christ, AD, 4 Roman legions were stationed around Israel, some to the north in Syria and others to the south in Egypt. It would have been various cohorts and auxiliaries of these legions that interacted with the Jews of Palestine. The legions were, and the only reason I mention these is because later on in church history, you'll run up against these various legions, and that's why I mention them here. I thought, for your knowledge, and you get on Jeopardy, you'll be able to win. So the 3rd, the 4th, the 6th, and the 10th. Now, they have names. Okay? These are Latin names, and the Latin names have to do with either where they were formed or some other aspect of that group. So the 3rd was called the Gallica, or Gallica, because it was formed from Gauls. And the Gauls lived, no, I don't have a map that'll work. The Gauls lived first in what we would call today north of Crimea. Okay, we know where that is because of the Ukrainian war. But north of Crimea, they migrated over to where we know as France. Then they migrated back over to where we call Turkey. And they left behind a lot of people in Turkey. And then they went back to France. And France actually was eventually called Gaul. Now, we're not sure whether this particular legion was formed in modern-day Turkey area or modern-day France area, but it was formed from one of those areas. Okay, that's why it's called Gallica. The Scythians formed from right where the war is going on today. We would call Ukraine. Okay, the Scythians were the progenitors of the Cossacks. When you see the word Scythian, think Cossack. Okay, so the Scythians were the ancestors of the Cossacks. The 6th was the Ferrata. And that was called, and ferrous is iron in Latin, and they were the Iron Legion. This is one that originated in Italy itself. And Fretensis, I forget what Fretensis was. I want to say frozen, that's not cool, that's not right. I'll have to look that back up again. But these were the 4 legions. A legion's about 1,000 guys, 1,000 soldiers, give or take. You would have about 600 infantrymen, and the rest would be cavalry, and then conscripts, fill-ins, auxiliaries they were called. Sometimes they were not as well trained, maybe. We later on they would kind of refer to them as cannon fodder. But about 1,000 guys, give or take, about 1,000 guys. Most likely it was soldiers and auxiliaries of the 10th Legion that were attached to Fortress Antonia. Remember, Fortress Antonia is that castle that is built right next to the temple in Jerusalem. And actually, on purpose, built there and built higher than the temple. So that the walls of the Fortress Antonia, from the walls, you look down on the temple. Remember, the temple's already pretty high. The temple walls are pretty big in Herod's day. So this was a big fortress. And it was named for your friend and mine, Proconsul Antonio, of the fame of Cleopatra and Antony. Okay, Antony and Cleopatra, right? Yeah, Cleopatra first had an affair with Julius Caesar, right? And then had another affair with, what's the other guy's name? Kind of Augustus, and then with Anthony. There was somebody else in the middle there. I can't think of who it was. Yeah, I can't think of who it was. Anyway, but she kind of played the field. She played the field, her and Anthony were famous lovers, of course, and they both died after Augustus defeated them at the Battle of Actium in Greece. Let's see. Yeah, question.
Pretensis is the armed guard
Oh, the strait. Yes, this was the strait. Yes, the Strait of Messina. Thank you. The Strait of Messina. So these were Sicilians. These were Sicilians and Italians from the boot heel of Italy. Okay, so this was another. The 6th and 10th were both Italian legions, whereas the 3rd and 4th were made up. They were made up of Romans, of course, but these were Romans who lived in extended places in the empire. So anyway, the 10th legion, the Strait Legion, was the one attached to Fortress Antonia and manned the various garrisons around Judea, Samaria, and Galilee. Many of these soldiers had been recruited from Syria and other non-Jewish parts of Palestine. Okay? Even though they may have been formed in Sicily, by this time, you're talking 300 years before, 200 to 300 years before. So by this time, where you get your soldiers is up in the air. I mean, you get them from anywhere. Just so happened that the 10th got a lot of their soldiers from Syria. And of course, the Syrians, even then, hated the Jews. And so what you've got is you've got a complicated situation here where the Roman soldiers are not just Roman, but a lot of them are now natives of Syria who have a natural dislike, a natural hatred for the Jews and the Jews for them. And don't think for 1 minute that a Jew can't tell the difference between somebody born in Italy and somebody born in Syria. They can. If not from their language and their accent, just from looking at it. Okay? You know, you have people even today who talk about the noble Roman nose, right? Right? Big Roman nose. Huh? Well, same thing. Syria, you know, Italians even then look different than Syrians, and so on and so forth. So the Jews knew they were being ruled over not just by Romans, but by Syrian Romans. Thus they knew the people and language of the area in general, had a great disdain for the Jews. The Syrians, again, hated the Jews, hated them, and would take any opportunity to beat them up, stab them, rob them, rape them, murder them. Anytime they had an opportunity to do any of those things, they would do them. It was not a friendly occupation. Now, in other places in the empire, it was a very friendly occupation. And there's all kinds of stories of Romans and natives, becoming fast friends and intermarrying and everything, and raising big families, and and then like up on the German border, a lot of Romans have settled up there and retired up there. A lot of Romans retired in France. A lot of them retired in Greece. A lot of them retired in Egypt. Became big retirement military communities. So yeah, it was not unheard of at all. But boy, no Roman would ever retire to Judea. Never. That would be asking for trouble. Okay? That would be like me retiring in Minnesota. Legions primarily consisted of infantry soldiers and a few troops of cavalry and archers present among the ranks. Roughly 30 legions were active at any given time within the empire, and each consisted, I was wrong, I said 1,000. I knew that was wrong when I said it. Approximately 6,000 or 7,000 soldiers and officers, including auxiliaries. A centurion, of which we are so often in the New Testament, was not as often assumed a commander of 1,000, as there were no such groups in a legion. They would have commanded perhaps 500 or 600 men or 5 or 6 cohorts. We can best see them as the equivalent of our U.S. Army, either of sergeant majors or perhaps colonels, depending on their ancestry. If they were of the equestrian class or the knighthood class in Rome, they would be the equivalent of our full-bird colonels. If they were not of the equestrian class, if they were just Etruscans, then they would probably be something along the lines of our sergeant majors, which is pretty good still, that's. Master sergeant's good, but sergeant major's even better. So, we can see them as most of those in Roman lineage would be what we called commissioned officers. Again, they came from the rule of the cultural group called the equestrians, meaning they were knights on horseback, and they always rode horses. History records that the Roman governor at the time of Christ, Pontius Pilate, was a terribly ruthless and cruel person. When Emperor Tiberius moved to Capri in semi-retirement, he left the empire in the hands of Sejanus, who was an extremely anti-Jewish. Pilate implemented Sejanus' policies in AD 26 with a vengeance. He massacred hundreds of Jews who had rioted in the temple area because he set up pagan emblems, Roman shields, overlooking the temple. You have to understand what's on the Roman shield. Okay, what's on us at various times. Roman shields changed over the centuries. But what was on the shield at this time was a image of Tiberius. Okay, and so what Pilate did, let me show you. What Pilate did was kind of crazy. So here again, the Temple Mount, okay, and here's the temple, and here's Fortress Antonia, okay, and you have these parapets, right, that overlook the temple. Here's what Pontius Pilate and Herod, with Herod's not blessing, well, maybe it was an argument, maybe a little bit. Anyway, put shields in every one of these holes, all around, including facing onto the courtyard of the temple, with this picture, okay, of Emperor Tiberius. And of course, what's the first commandment? No other gods, right? And of course, the rest of the Protestant churches make a second commandment out of the second part, which is about images, right? Which the Jews took, and the Muslims do today, took very, very seriously. Okay? And so, can you imagine you're getting ready to go to church, you're going to church, and you're going to church. Let's say you're going to our chapel here, and instead of the icons that are there, in place of every icon in the church over there is a big, huge portrait of Joe Biden. Okay? Or a big, huge portrait of Donald Trump, whichever. Right? Doesn't matter. But anyway, a big, huge image, political image of a political ruler. And in the Roman case, of course, they believed that their emperor was God. So it would also be religion. So on every one of those icons, I would do, instead of the icons of Jesus, there would be one of Buddha, and there would be one of Confucius, and there would be one of, some Hindu, Vishnu and Shiva, and all the way around the building. Imagine that. You would be a little offended, wouldn't you? You'd be a little ticked off. You would find it a little hard to worship. Yeah, you would. You would find it very hard to worship. So this is what happened. They walked into the temple, and they're looking up, and hey, God, they look over there. Hey, what the world's that? Good grief, that's Tiberius looking down on me. About a bunch of, yeah. So anyway, they rioted. Well, again, there was a door in the porthole in the Fortress Antonia with a ramp that went right down into the actual courtyard of the temple. Okay? So the cohort, or 2 or 3, would be 100 guys, would pour out and down this ramp and into the, and it was illegal for anyone to carry a weapon. It was a no-gun zone. Okay? No weapon zone. The temple, you could not carry a weapon into the temple. The only people, and even the temple guards could not have swords or bows and arrows or spears. The only thing that the temple guard could carry was clubs. Big stick. Okay? Yeah, that was the only thing you had to control people. So you've got a completely unarmed bunch of people that are rioting. They're upset because of the picture of Tiberius looking down on them. The Romans see the riot. They go to control the riot, so they open those doors and right down into the temple. And of course, they got swords and bows and arrows and spears and javelins and all kinds of other stuff and shields. And it's kind of like, it's kind of like the riot police, the SWAT team against, a bunch of middle schoolers. It's not much of a battle. And so the Jews get massacred. I forget how many. Thousands, I think, if I remember correctly. Thousands. No, no, my goodness, no. It was before the first Jewish war. Yeah, yeah. This was before Jesus' ministry. Pontius Pilate massacred hundreds. Tiberius, who, like Augustus, looked quite favorably upon the Jews people, heard of this and the ambition of Sejanus through Caligula. Yeah, that's a name we all know, huh? So he returned to Rome. Now, Tiberius was not a happy camper. He was retired, and he liked it on the Isle of Capri. Remember that song from the 50s, the Isle of Capri? Mm-hmm. Nice place. Nice place. Rowing bass, relax. And so somebody whispered in his ear one day, hey, those guys are killing Jews and murdering a bunch of them. And he and his uncle Augustus, they liked the Jews. They have the Jews pretty classy people. And so he got mad and he had to go back to Rome. Now, if he goes back to Rome, he's not a happy camper. And so Sejanus was executed. Now, 18 October, AD 31. 32, Tiberius ordered the governors not to offend the Jews. So all the governors got the same order, including Pontius Pilate. And 32 is a very interesting date because we're pretty sure that Jesus' crucifixion takes place in 33. So you see why Pontius Pilate did not want to upset the Jews. If the Jews wanted to crucify Jesus, he got to let them. Otherwise, Tiberius is going to have his head. You see, there's a lot more behind the story than you know. You don't know what else is going on in the background. All right? You besides Pilate's wife, she's on one side saying, hey, don't have nothing to do with that guy, he's innocent. Pilate says, I know, but I got this message from the emperor saying, don't tick off the Jews. What am I going to do? Wash my hands on the whole thing. Yeah, really. Pilate was now forced to ingratiate himself to the emperor, and he feared another uprising of the Jews. This is why he tried to placate the Jewish leaders and ask what they wanted him to do with Jesus. Now you know the rest of the story, see? 2 years earlier, he would never have done that. He would have told the Jews to go pound sand, and he would have let Jesus go, and that would have been the end of it. Matter of fact, he would have purposely let Jesus go just to stick his finger in their eye because he hated him. But now, with the emperor on his back, he's got to play nice. Pilate could not afford to get in trouble with Tiberius, or else he would no longer be a friend of Caesar. You remember that phrase? Do you remember? They called that out on Good Friday, didn't you? You're no friend of Caesar. That term, friend of Caesar, very important term, folks. It has great historical meaning. Friend of Caesar. A friend of Caesar means you do what Caesar wants. This is also why his former enemy, Herod Antipas, now became his friend, as the Herod family had good relations with the emperor. Herod was a favorite of the Augustinian family, and thus of Tiberius, Augustine's nephew. And so Pilate, knowing that, because he was in Rome with Herod, was in Rome, and he knew Herod gets to sit up at the front table with the emperor. And so Pilate figures, hey, if I'm going to have any kind of success in my future, my life, in my chosen profession here, I better hobnob with the Herod guy. More than anything else, Rome wanted peace in their territories, and thus the client kings and governors had to comply and at least attempt to placate the native people. We'll stop there for questions. Again, folks, fascinating history once you learn the backstory. Once you learn the backstory, then the Gospels become very, very clear and very, very easy to understand. It takes all the mystery out of it. We now know why Pilate did the things he did, and why Herod did what he did, and why the Pharisees did what they did, and why the Sadducees did what they did, why the Sanhedrin did what they did. It all becomes clear once you know a little history. And see, in past centuries, people knew this history. They learned this history in school. We don't in this country, not for a long time, not since World War I, really. Before World War I, maybe, but not after. I want to try to get to the next section a little bit, just get going in it. Because it's important to know also not just what's going on with the people and individuals, but also with society. What's going on with society? What kind of society was Jesus born into? And what kinds of society does he live in? That's important to know too. For full civil rights, people had to prove their Jewish, and now I'm talking Israel, of course, their Jewish ancestry. Many claimed a Davidic or Benjaminite line. Why? Because those are the only 2 tribes left. Remember the other 10 tribes? Lost. Okay? Because the Messianic line was the most common and best preserved. They would seldom claim to be one of the 10 lost tribes, as these were seen as inferior. Often the lay genealogies would include priests too. Genealogies of the priests and leaders were usually quite accurate and authentic, at least through the 4th century. However, many of the lay genealogies were most likely pure invention. Today, it would be near, and I want you to understand this last sentence, please. Don't call me an anti-Semite for saying this, but this is true. Today, it would be nearly impossible for any modern Jew to be able to claim pure descent from any of Abraham's descendants. And DNA studies have proven this over and over and over again. You don't read anything about it. Nobody ever talks about it. You'll never see it in the New York Times. You'll never see it in the Washington Post. But and you would imagine when DNA testing and stuff first came out, you would think the Jews would be first in line, and they were. The only thing is, what they found was that they weren't Jews. As much as they thought they were, they weren't. And so this information was buried, and you won't find it anywhere. This is very hush-hush. This is not spoken of in polite society because this is considered racist. If you say there's no such thing as Jews anymore, you're a racist. But the DNA proves it, folks. So what we have today is generation and generation after generation after generation of cultural Jews. People who came into Judaism for the religion or for the culture way back when in the Middle Ages or maybe even earlier in their family history. But no real connection genetically, bloodlinely, to any descendant of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But because they converted and came into Judaism and adopted the culture and adopted the language and adopted the customs and adopted the thinking and the language and everything else, they became cultural Jews. And then, of course, their children, their grandchildren, their great-grandchildren, and great-grandchildren also did the same thing. Okay? So, I mean, they are Jews in the sense of their culture and their custom and their thinking and their religion, maybe even. But as far as actual relations to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, no. Yes?
Do modern day Jews today know this? Do they know this?
Some do. Some do. It has been, there were some early seminars back in the 90s and even in the 80s where these things were discussed, but they got shut down pretty fast. And your average run-of-the-mill, typical Jew, especially non-practicing Jew, they have no clue. Yes, sir.
Possible to trace back our Jewish heritage, and all of our other sisters shut her down.
Yeah.
Like, don't say that
Yeah.
we've
Right.
been Jewish,
Right.
because they can trace it back to the 1700s.
Right.
It's kind of
Yeah, it does.
and so
Yeah, even some of the strictest Hasidim families can only trace their lineage back to maybe the 1400s, 1500s.
So any of that history or any of that information is just not there anymore.
Just lost. It's lost. Just lost. Yeah, it's
They
lost.
couldn't claim.
No.
Well,
They,
because the Jews were so persecuted during those centuries,
Mhm.
so they liked that opinion.
Yeah, yeah. And they had to move a lot, and a lot of times they either didn't or couldn't carry records with them, and so it was all mouth to mouth. It was all ear to mouth. Kind of. Well, yeah, your uncle was Jewish. Well, where was he from? Well, he was from the Caspian Sea area. Well, that's not where Jews are from. Well, I know, but when he came from the Caspian Sea area, he was Jewish. He practiced Judaism. Oh, okay. But again, once you start getting into the actual blood, you start actually looking at the genes and chromosomes, and you start looking at the DNA. They're not.
They would have a hard time if they decided to do one of these DNA things where
They don't.
they don't.
Oh, they don't. No, they are advised against it. Oh yeah, they are advised against it. I have my youngest daughter has a good friend who's Jewish, and in their circles, it is don't forgive, don't spit in a bucket, and send it in, because you'll be very, very disappointed. It'll shake you right to the foundation of your faith. But he eats ham sandwiches all the time, so I don't think it would matter to him. He loves pepperoni pizza, so yeah. He's a pretty. I mean, he goes to Sabbat maybe once or twice a year. He goes to, they do Hanukkah, but he's not a practicing Jew, in other words. But yeah, in his circles, there are a couple in his family that are pretty strict, but they're told don't do that. Don't do that. You will not like. And I tell people that all the time. I tell everybody that. You'd be surprised what you find.
Yeah.
And maybe Uncle Charlie's great story about you being next in line to the Cherokee throne or something turns out to be not so true. I'm supposed to be 132nd Cherokee because my great-great-great-grandfather married a Cherokee princess. But my daughter did her DNA, and she was was it 64? I don't think it was 64th, which it would be, because my wife has no Indian blood at all. She's almost exactly 50% Polish, 50% Irish, and 100% mad all the time. She got a T-shirt that says that. So that sweatshirt, I bought it for her. I'm 50% half Polish, half Irish, and all mad all the time. All right, we'll have to cut it off there. I don't want to drag this out. Boy, we're still not got to the meat, have we? I'm going to try to speed it up next time a little bit, but there's just so much information that most people just don't know, and it really helps when you're into these debates between Jesus and the Pharisees, or Jesus and the scribes, or and Jesus, it just really, really helps to understand and know what was going on behind all this that caused this ruckus. So anyway, we're picking up there concerning the genealogy of Jesus.
And that's on the 22nd?
Yes, it is, my friend.
There may be something.
Third, close with prayer?
Not this session. These